Before we begin this week's show, just a reminder that we are going to be appearing live next week, October the 5th, as part of the Podcast Live Politics show in central London. We're kicking off at 2:30 p.m, although there are great podcasts being recorded throughout the day, and we will be joined by our special guest, LBC For the Many podcaster, Ian Dale. There'll be a Q&A at the end of the session as well, so you can ask us all the things that you've been dying to ask us over the years and that we're not prepared to say on mic. Be sure to get your ticket today by going to podcastlive.com. Use the code WEEK10, that's WEEK10, at checkout to get a 10% discount on the ticket price, and hopefully we'll see you there. It's the week ending Saturday the 28th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Supreme Court ruling that Boris Johnson acted unlawfully in proroguing Parliament, President Trump facing an impeachment inquiry, and in slightly happier news, Phoebe Waller-Bridge winning 3 Emmys. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today is the editor of The Week magazine, Theo Tait, from theweek.com, our US site, Jessica Hullinger, and The Week UK's digital boss man, Holden Frith. And Holden, you get to start the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
It turns out Labour wants to keep the green flag flying.
We recognise that the first industrial revolution meant Britain was the first major contributor to climate change, something that left a lasting legacy for the global south. And to begin making some reparations for our colonial past, I pledge we will provide the citizens of the global south free or cheap access to the green technologies that we develop as part of our green industrial revolution.
Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell's speech to the Labour conference this week. This newsline got rather overshadowed by some other headlines, Holden. I can't think why. But tell us what John McDonnell was proposing there.
Yeah, for a change, I've brought a fairly straightforward news story from this week and a clip that actually explains all the information we have about it. And because it has been overshadowed by other events, both at the Labour conference and clearly the Supreme Court and the US, there has not actually been that much of a follow-up. So there's little else to go on except this pledge to start what sounds like a programme of reparations for Britain's colonial past, but to pay them instead of money or grants in the form of technology and knowledge that will allow the developing world to make a leap forward in terms of renewable energy.
Okay, and has there been as limited amount of reaction to this as there has been news coverage?
There really has, and even the Daily Mail, which would tend to get more exercised about this, it just covered it in a very, very neutrally worded 5-paragraph story that was a sidebar to its main report on John McDonnell's speech, which was taking a much more hostile approach to his plans for a 4-day working week. So it really does feel that it has slipped beneath the radar entirely.
Okay, well, it wouldn't take much, would it, Jess, to imagine what the Daily Mail would say about this if they had noticed it, which is, don't we give enough money to other countries through foreign aid, and wasn't slavery a really long time ago, so what's this got to do with green policy now? Had they said that, would they have a point?
They would have a point, but I think it would be a bad point. And you see similar arguments in the States where people say slavery was a really long time ago. How does this impact us today? But, you know, the truth is that the inequalities that linger from slavery and inequality in healthcare, in income, in various other ways, they linger. So I think that it's a bad argument.
But is it a good idea to take the fruits of a seemingly completely unconnected policy and give those back to countries from which Britain received slaves and goods? I mean, green policy isn't directly connected in most people's minds to reparation for slavery.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is that because climate change is such a huge issue now, that we would somehow give people a leg up in combating the effects of climate change, and that would repay sort of the sins that have taken place. But I feel a little bit like it's completely separate. And I also feel like it is so far in the future, the effects that will come from the so-called green industrial revolution, like when would they actually happen and how would they happen? It seems like a bit of a pipe dream.
Yeah, well, the first thing, Theo, is that not only, of course, would the Labour government have to come to power to enact this, but they then would have to develop some green technology that would be worth sharing.
Yeah, it's good that they're promising something, the results of something that really hasn't happened yet at all. at some unspecified point in the future. And I don't know. I actually think there is a specific thing about the climate because there seem to be two things they were saying. One is that there was some reparations for our colonial past, and the other is the sort of wider point that we who industrialised first have left a serious legacy, emissions-wise, and that therefore that would be some form of reparation for that, which does seem like a reasonable point. I guess what I wonder is that whether calling it reparations is a particularly helpful way of doing it. It's a loaded term. It pisses a lot of people off. It just seems like, the whole point of development, certainly as it happens in Britain, there's a clear kind of undertow of colonial guilt. Whether you actually do anything helpful by, officialising it and saying it's actually reparations doesn't seem very clear to me at all. I feel like it just will annoy people.
Well, what countries specifically was John McDonnell referring to, Holden? Because he just used these very generic terms, which I'd never heard in politics before, global north and global south. I don't know what that means.
Yeah, it is. I think it's the politically correct form of talking about developing countries, poor countries, what used to be called the third world. And I think, one of the problems with reparations in general is deciding who qualifies for them. And clearly because of the timescales that have elapsed, if you're talking about either slavery or colonial land confiscations, you would be compensating the descendants of those people. And I think there is a compelling moral argument that says a lot of countries that were colonialized had vast amounts of resources extracted from them militarily, and that they may well have suffered and still be suffering economically because of that. But even at this more national level of compensation, where you'd be providing technology to a country that ideally everyone would benefit from, including those of us in the West, you'd still run into the question of who qualifies. And would the UK only provide this assistance to former UK colonies? Would Germany be expected to provide similar assistance to former German colonies? Or would it be a much broader programme of kind of knowledge transfer from going back to the Marxist idea of from each according to their means to each according to their needs?
And would it include Commonwealth countries that we have a good relationship with, who aren't asking for reparations, that we continue to have a good relationship with, hence the Commonwealth? And if it doesn't, then what's the point of the Commonwealth? Because the whole idea is we share information and ideas and money.
Well, I think one of the reasons that this is an idea worth looking at in more detail, and it feels to me like quite an elegant way of looking at this problem, is one of the objections you often hear in the UK and the West generally to the idea of doing anything ourselves about climate change is the question of, well, what is India doing about it? Look at all the pollution they produce. And so if you can somehow connect these two, and I don't think India is crying out for reparations, India is doing pretty well for itself. But if by creating some kind of program, you could allow India to take a huge leap forward into a much cleaner form of economic development, then it's really hard to see a downside to that.
Well, except I suppose some people in India would say it was just another form of colonialism again. It's the Brits coming over telling us how to use our fossil fuels.
Yeah, and that definitely is a risk. One of the other objections to the idea of reparations is often the risk of corruption. And with cash, it's easier to see that risk than it would be with technology. But even technology can be misappropriated and misused. So the more control that gets exerted over how technology is implemented, which companies you would have to use, and what kind of contracts would be drawn up, the more you get into that sense that actually this is simply another form of colonialism.
But if this was about the environment first and foremost, just take the colonialism out of it for a minute. If this was a Green Party policy talking about what they'd do if they actually got into number 10 rather than a Labour Party policy, surely the point of it being environmentally friendly would be to make this technology free to everybody. Like the point of environmental policy is it only works if everyone in the world does it.
But wouldn't the point be that you would take responsibility for installing these things? I mean, you can share technology and that's fine, but you also pay for infrastructure. I mean, DFID already does a lot of this stuff anyway.
Oh, tell us about that.
Over the past sort of 20 years, the idea now is that you invest in infrastructure, and a lot of that is a big theme is the environment for them now, because it's important and it's a good way of investing in countries, when they're developing rather than waiting till they've gone another way and then. But I don't know a load about it. I just know that they do take it seriously.
When you say the idea now is to invest in infrastructure, that's because there have been scandals involving the attribution of cash to other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been in lots of ways. Development has been, has a fairly disastrous history. I think DFID does it as well as anyone does. It's just very complicated, putting a large amount of money into any country, particularly if it's not particularly well run.
Jess, would this help sway your vote? Do you think this is a vote winner? Is it something you'd be thinking about as you put your cross in the ballot box?
I think, like I alluded to earlier, it sounds a little bit like a Hail Mary to me. Like, I don't know that this would sway a lot of votes. I think that if we were really interested in reparations and in dealing with the sins of the past, I think that there might be other more direct ways of doing it. So, for example, Britain could allow for debt write-offs of various nations, can contribute to the health and education spending. I think there are other more direct ways. And also, I think it's worth noting that I don't think we've ever officially apologized for slavery and, all the damage we did in various colonies. So I think that this feels a little bit far-reaching, and I don't think that for me and for a lot of other voters, this would sway them or be a huge reason to vote for the Labour Party.
Yeah, and actually some of the language that's used, I mean, even just the word reparation, to the common man and woman in the street isn't necessarily something they can even understand what it means, Holden. If you're serious about, as Jess suggests, making good on some of the horrific things that happened in Britain's past, it needs to be more visceral than that, doesn't it? It needs to be a history lesson. It needs to be blood was spilt and here's why we're doing this.
I would agree with that, but I think attaching that to something that feels like some sort of restorative justice would make that count for more. And it does feel to me as if this idea of reparations, and whether we call them that, I think, is up for question. But it at least it has that cut through, I think, although in this case it doesn't seem to have provoked any reaction. But it does feel as if this is an idea that is moving into the mainstream, and that even a few years ago, the idea of reparations for slavery or colonialism was talked about only really on the extreme fringes of the argument, and now it is gradually making its way towards the mainstream. It feels like it might be an idea whose time has come.
All right, Jessica, your idea has its time after this. Okay, next up it's Jessica. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This was the week that a sperm shortage scare came to France.
For 4 years you lived for this, through this. We've spent €45,000 in 4 years. It's not illegal to have an ART abroad. We need to be very clear about that. It is legal. What's not legal is to have an ART in France for lesbian couples or for single women. Because of this, I had to exile myself in order to have a child. I have, for every single second of the process, deplored the fact I was not able to do it in France.
A clip from a Euronews video. Jessica, can you explain what the woman in that clip was talking about and why this is news?
Yeah, so this week the French Parliament began debating a law that would allow single women and lesbian couples to be eligible for fertility treatment in France. So as it stands now, only heterosexual married couples are eligible for IVF.
Wow. So not even heterosexual couples in steady relationships. You have to be married as well.
I'm actually not sure. I don't think that's the case.
That's not true?
You have to have been together for 2 years.
Right. There are a lot of parameters you have to meet, but you have to be heterosexual.
Interesting. And that's different, isn't it, to what it is here in Britain?
Right. My understanding is here in Britain, every woman is entitled to apply for IVF.
And it's Macron's concept to change this. This was one of his pledges.
Right. So this is a big push by Macron, and it's been quite controversial. One of the issues right now is this idea of a sperm shortage. So clinicians have said that there will be a sort of run on sperm if this goes through, that there will be a roughly 2/3 increase in demand for IVF, and that the wait for IVF will increase. Right now it's about 12 months, and that the wait will jump. But it's also been controversial because, religious people in France have said this is bad for children, it'll be depriving children of the right to a father. I think the conservative right is quite concerned just generally about the idea of letting same-sex couples have equal rights to heterosexual couples in a lot of ways, and this is one of them.
Do you agree, Theo, that that's what's going on here, that the sperm shortage is a sort of Trojan horse, really, and behind it are conservative values that are motivating people's upset?
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. I think they have a well-organised Catholic lobby in France, don't they? But I think if you look at other European nations which don't have those rules, it has proved extremely uncontroversial, to not have discrimination written into the law. And I don't think it probably will. There'll be more of a fuss there than in other places, I think, because there is a Catholic protest movement. But I'm sure in the long run, everyone will get behind it.
Well, not just uncontroversial, Holden, but frankly, I'd imagine quite uncommon. I mean, I haven't looked at the statistics on this, but if you think of IVF as fertility treatment rather than a way of getting pregnant, I mean, it in itself is complex and drawn out and expensive. This will only affect gay couples and single women, presumably, who have tried a traditional sperm bank or, having sex with a man they know first. So, I mean, how many women actually are affected by this need for fertility treatment within a gay couple?
I think the numbers are probably very small. It's actually quite difficult to find numbers because there's a sort of a network of unconnected fertility clinics. So it's finding any kind of national statistics is really difficult. When the law was changed in the UK, I don't really remember there being any dispute about it. It was in 2005. And I think what is a lot more common amongst gay couples is adoption, and there has been a lot more debate about that than IVF. But specifically on the IVF, I think the other side of this change in the law is that it will also remove the right to anonymity of donors, and so that's expected to reduce the number of donations by 75%. And so as well as increasing the demand side of the equation, you're also going to be cutting the supply.
Okay, I mean, I do see that argument. Even if you think, why would opening up IVF create a shortage in sperm donations, you can see that if at the same time they're making it so you're no longer anonymous, that it's probably reasonable to question whether that would, shrink the amount of sperm donations that are made.
Yeah, I think that that's true, but I truly don't think that there's going to be a shortage of sperm in France.
It's quite interesting that in France they have a nationalised sperm supply. So this is one of the reasons why they don't have a lot of it, because in the big suppliers to the world are Denmark and the US, both of which allow anonymity and allow people to be paid, which is why they are the great exporters of sperm to the rest of the world. And so in France they have not only a state-regulated one, but also you can't be paid, and now they're going to lift anonymity, so that's going to be difficult.
This is a bit of an aside, but because you can be paid in America and elsewhere to give your sperm, people who have done IVF through sperm donation have realized that there are numerous people in their community who have used the same donor. And so their children have the same father, and they find it a bit irksome, as you would. And it's raised a lot of questions about what limits do we put on sperm donation. And so it's worth considering.
Well, I think something that is worth considering directly as part of this story is what limits we should put on IVF, because sperm donation is kind of an aside. But if you're having IVF, and the general principle in favour of what Macron is delivering is let's open it up to more people, there nonetheless are regulations around that. I mean, the story that kind of caught everyone's attention earlier this summer was the 74-year-old woman who gave birth after IVF and then shortly afterwards fell ill. I mean, wherever you are politically, there's a point at which people feel uncomfortable with this.
Yeah, I think the question is where do we draw the line? And especially as we look forward into the future with IVF, I mean, women are waiting longer to have children. We're living longer. Fertility is going to become more of a problem as we go into the future, and therefore IVF is going to become more common. So I think it raises a really interesting question of, when biology is no longer an issue with whether or not you can have a child, what are the issues?
And I think what makes this a difficult debate is that if you are a fertile heterosexual couple, the barriers to entry for parenthood are very, very low. And there's no question of the state judging suitability for parenthood, and any kind of intervention on that front just feels like a terrible infringement of individual liberty. But as soon as the state or a private healthcare company is intervening to grant a child to a couple or an individual who wouldn't otherwise have been able to produce that child, I think then the question of how suitable and how do you judge how suitable a parent is and what life will that child have becomes acutely important.
And I suppose maybe that's where the discrimination in favour of heterosexuals has its grounding, isn't it, Theo? People say, well, in a heterosexual relationship, there might be the expectation that fertility is something that would come down the road. But if you are in a homosexual relationship, there's no expectation that you're naturally going to conceive a child. So is it right that the state should help you in that aim?
Even in Britain, where we have much more liberal laws, the state already imposes, certain constraints when it comes to IVF. You only get a certain amount of, is it 1 round or something, or 2 rounds, or I can't remember. Yeah, and they also have to be in certain age brackets, and it depends which postcode you're in and all that. So, I think as far as the state is providing a service, it's always going to qualify those in some way.
And I think the problem with the French approach as it currently stands is it's based on the assumption that every single heterosexual couple will be better at parenting than every single homosexual couple or single woman, whereas really you should be looking at a range of different factors, and it may be that having 2 parents is better than 1 if all else is equal, but in the real world all else won't be equal, and some single women may be able to provide a better childhood than some heterosexual married couples.
And Jess, we heard the lady in the clip that we played talking about leaving France to have treatment, and presumably only to somewhere like Belgium across the border, but nonetheless leaving France. I guess that kind of begs the question, if you have the resources to do it, does this affect you at all? Is this something that's just going to disproportionately affect people that are reliant on the state to provide their IVF?
Right. So I think it's an interesting question about whether or not this should be public or privately funded, right? So if you can afford to leave the country and go somewhere else, or to pay for private IVF treatment, then is it going to be something in the future where only people who earn a lot of money are going to be able to try IVF over and over and over again? So I think it's quite a tricky question.
Okay, thanks for that. Our final story in just a moment. But a reminder for the final time, as I said at the top of the show, next Thursday's edition is going to be postponed by a few days because we're recording it live at Podcast Live Politics in London. You can either wait to hear the episode land in your earphones as usual, although it'll be at the weekend, or you can be there in person and see it. The address again, podcastlive.com, and use the code WEEK10 at checkout for a 10% discount on the ticket price. Okay, Theo, you're up next after this. And finally this week, it's Theo. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was that the sound of opportunity knocking or the ice cracking?
From the barren backcountry that many thought it to be in Seward's time, the Arctic is at the forefront of opportunity and abundance. It houses 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of its undiscovered gas, and an abundance of uranium, rare earth minerals, gold, diamonds, and millions of square miles of untapped resources. Fisheries galore. And its centerpiece, the Arctic Ocean, is rapidly taking on new strategic significance.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo there, talking on a video from the US Department of State entitled Looking North, Sharpening America's Arctic Focus. Theo, what is this new strategic significance of the Arctic Ocean then?
Since 1979, the Arctic Ocean has lost 40% of its sea ice. The reason it's in the news this week is that NASA put out its latest satellite data showing that the summer ice was at its second ever lowest extent. So basically the ice is melting very fast out there, and obviously the more it melts, the less it reflects. So the warmer the sea gets because it goes onto the dark sea instead of the white ice. And you can look at it as an environmental disaster, as many people do, or you can look at it as a wonderful opportunity, which is how Mike Pompeo seems to see it.
I see. So this is glass half full stuff. What does he say the positive sides are to this melting ice?
We've got oil, we've got minerals, we've got new shipping routes, we've got fisheries galore, as he put it. There are 5 Arctic nations which are on the Arctic littoral, which is Norway, Canada, America, Russia and Denmark, and they're all fighting, lodging overlapping claims for the mineral resources, particularly the oil, but also the other things like rare earth minerals and oil, uranium of the far north.
So, Jess, is this what was motivating that farce a few weeks ago with Trump saying he wanted to buy Greenland?
Yeah, definitely. So America is interestingly kind of behind other nations in making preparations for the sort of plundering of the Arctic. And I think that what has pushed Trump towards this idea is that his 2 favorite competitors, Russia and China, are investing very heavily in exploring the Arctic. So Russia has the ships, it has a lot of icebreakers to go exploring. And of course, in 2007, it planted a flag on the North Pole, making a sort of symbolic claim as to what lies beneath. And China, hilariously, has declared itself a polar superpower, even though it is nowhere near the Arctic and is investing in icebreakers as well. So I don't think Trump can resist the urge to become a polar superpower as well. And I think that certainly motivated him to make the ridiculous claim that he was going to buy Greenland.
But politically, actually, it could be beneficial, couldn't it, for countries like the USA to be trying to do deals with countries in Scandinavia rather than the Gulf? I mean, you can see the appeal of that for them.
What kind of deals to buy their
drilling
oil?
rights, routes, whatever it is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think America is often trying to buy Greenland. It tried to buy it in 1946, and I think in the 1880s as well. It's obviously very attractive to them.
But we've seen the dangers of being so reliant on the Gulf states for America, and this is actually, like, genuinely, from their point of view, you could see why this would be appealing.
The whole race for the Arctic has led to some very strange alliances. So in this, we talked before about China's claims of sovereignty over the South China Sea and the way that the US there has been mounting naval expeditions called freedom of navigation operations, where it sends warships through shipping channels to try and keep them open. In this particular dispute over the Arctic, Russia exerts extraterritorial claims over the sea routes that would get you from China north of Siberia, north of Norway, and through Europe that way, which is a much quicker route than the existing one and has only recently been opened up to shipping because of the melting of the ice. And actually there, China is very much in favour of freedom of navigation operations because it wants the US to blaze a trail through the waters that Russia claims sovereignty over. And even more bizarrely, you have Canada standing shoulder to shoulder with Russia against the US and China, saying actually no, it should be national governments which claim sovereignty, and Canada says that the Northwest Passage is its and it wants to levy charges on shipping that's going to use those waters.
Can investigating this kind of thing stand on the same platform as governments who say they want to do the best thing for the environment? Because these plans only come to fruition if the ice keeps melting.
Well, what's so fascinating about this is that speech that you heard was actually given at the Arctic Council in May. And the Arctic Council is a group of all the Arctic nations that used to try and discuss things like environmental stewardship.
Pop quiz, who are the Arctic nations?
There are 8 of them.
Go on, how many can you do?
I can do Norway, Canada, America, Russia, Denmark, and then the other ones that don't have a shoreline but are represented in the Arctic Council because they're in the Arctic Circle are Iceland, Finland and Sweden.
Amazing. I'm impressed. Carry on.
So at the Arctic Council, he gave this amazing speech about the fisheries galore and all the oil. America refused to endorse the communique at the end because it contained the word climate change. So they're simultaneously tucking into all these resources that are going to get freed up and refusing to accept why it's happening, which is rather extraordinary.
And there is the risk of a vicious circle developing whereby as ice melts, it opens up more and more areas to drilling for fossil fuels, which once burned will contribute to that melting of the ice.
It's so
terrible
short-sighted,
feedback
isn't it?
loop.
It is, and it's in bad taste, isn't it, as much as anything? I mean, it's kind of like when we had the hottest day of the year ever earlier this year when we broke the records, and there was that feeling. I saw Caitlin Moran in the Times compare it to record breakers, where the BBC weather people were kind of like, we can do this, yes, it's the hottest day of all time. There's just that kind of bad taste element of it's not really a competition you should be celebrating, really. This is effectively saying climate change is great because it opens up more opportunities for drilling.
Absolutely. What's quite sad is if you think about the Antarctic, they did a brilliant treaty, I think, in 1959, where they declared it to be international and that they would have no militarization and they would have only opened up for scientific investigation and nothing else. And obviously, there are so many resources in the Arctic that that's just not going to happen.
And it does seem to be bringing out the worst nature in people, even in unexpected places. So both Canada and Norway, not known for their aggressive military stances, have been ordering naval vessels that specifically to patrol their parts of the Arctic. They say that these are defensive moves, often against Russia, but there's also a strong sense that they are trying to exert their sovereignty over these areas with the aim of exploiting them either for mineral drilling or for shipping rights.
Well, that's it, isn't it? Someone's going to be exploiting these resources. So, Jess, from a North American perspective, if Pompeo was a Democrat, would the strategy really be any different?
Yeah, I don't know if that's true. I mean, I think Obama did quite a lot to preserve various offshore oil reserves. I don't think that's true. I think environmentalism and preserving the Arctic, a lot of people are really concerned about it.
The Democrats did, well, they had all the environmental protections on Alaska, which are currently in the process of being lifted, didn't they? So I think they have a much better record.
And I think if we are looking for leadership, then we certainly shouldn't expect it to come from Russia, because they're one of the very few countries in the world that actually stands to gain from climate change. Like, the warming of the air will lead to large areas which are currently under ice becoming productive agriculturally. And the Russian government has talked explicitly about this and is almost like record breakers cheering on the idea of a warmer Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Like, a lot of the talk is about whether or not this will culminate in sort of military conflict, and I think that that's a reasonable question. But I think that it's worth pointing out that, yes, the Arctic is warming, but it is still really, really cold. And I don't think that this is going to happen overnight. And I read this great quote in the National Geographic from Brigadier General Mike Nixon, who said, if someone actually decided to launch an attack over the pole, it would quickly turn into the largest search and rescue operation the world has ever seen. So, I mean, that's wildly optimistic, but I don't think that this is going to happen overnight, and I think that there's still time.
Good. All right. Glad to know that we're not all facing our imminent demise. Thank you for that, Jessica Hullinger. My thanks as well to Theo Tait and Holden Frith. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. We may not have fisheries galore, but we do have episodes galore. Just explore our back catalogue. You can find it by typing The Week Unwrapped into your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.